And it looks like the first slide is up, so that's good. Let's see, where am I? Right there. Okay, so here we go. This is the what's become the standard first slide for this process. It's the San Luis Obispo Railroad Museum website. And we pointed out there's mainly for the donate button, which is on the top here, kind of in red. If you click on support, you get this little drop down thing. And you can choose to donate something to the museum if you're willing to help keep it alive during this all this shutdown stuff where basically there's no income. And you'll also notice since the last time there's a new item on the front page about the PMT trailers that Brad is trying to get going, and has some information up now, so you can click there and learn about what's going on with getting that exhibit all set up. So that's some fun stuff. But today we're going to talk about the geology train that the Cumbres and Toltec Scenic Railroad runs every summer, or at least did for a while. They didn't run one this year, mainly because New Mexico didn't open up, didn't allow them to open up until very recently, like some number of weeks ago maybe. And they usually run this train in June, sometime in June. So they couldn't go all the way to Chama, New Mexico. We'll see what on a map here what that did to them, but they could only basically run on half the railroad, having to turn around at the kind of the midway point until the first one of these was done in 2011. So they've been at it a little while, and hopefully it'll be back next year. So here's a map of the area. You can see the dashed line across the middle of the screen is the state line between Colorado and New Mexico, and this is about center, pretty close to center of Colorado, at the southern border of Colorado. So you can see the route. Antonito is the terminus at one end, Antonito, Colorado, and Chama, New Mexico is the terminus for the railroad at the other end. And it's about 64 miles the entire trip from Antonito to Chama. This is old Denver and Rio Grande Western track. Interestingly enough, you cross the border about 11 times, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth as you take this trip. It was built. The railroad was built like a lot of railroads in the western states for mining, and here in particular silver mining out of the San Juan Mountains. We'll see in a minute where those are on the map. In 1880, as a narrow gauge railroad, they actually started regauging it to standard gauge in about 1890, but when the Sherman Act came along in 1893, it effectively killed the silver business, so they stopped the regauging process. Along here, there's some interesting things. The Cumbres Pass, which is towards the end of the trip, over in this vicinity somewhere, the Cumbres station is marked there on that white dot, is 10,015 feet in altitude. That's the highest railroad pass, highest operating railroad pass in the United States, interestingly enough. And also, not too far from that same spot along the railroad, you go across the top of a gorge, the Toltec Gorge, which is what the name of the railroad is, by the way, named from. The Cumbres Pass and the Toltec Gorge is how they got Cumbres and Toltec Railroad. It's about an 800 feet deep gorge that rivers cut down through the rocks there. And other history-wise, the railroad was bought jointly by the two states, Colorado and New Mexico, about 1970. Paid just over $500,000 for it, and they've owned it and operated it ever since. This is just an interesting little side note that I stumbled onto preparing for this talk. Some of you probably are maybe familiar with Fenn's treasure. And he was a kind of eccentric art collector, art dealer, and he buried a treasure somewhere in the Rocky Mountains and gave clues to it on his website or some in a book, or I'm not exactly sure exactly how it was worth or how it worked. But the interesting thing was twofold. One is that the treasure was recently discovered earlier this year, not too long ago, and also the whereabouts of exactly where it was found was not disclosed. The guy who found it and Fenn both agreed that they wouldn't talk about who actually found it and exactly where they found it. I saw two different things about where it might have been found. I think on Fenn's website, which is likely the most reliable, there was some mention of somewhere in Wyoming. But on another, it had stated it was found somewhere in New Mexico, which could make a little bit of sense because Fenn lived in Santa Fe, New Mexico. He recently passed away, as it turns out, like last week. So a lot of things have happened in this particular world. But what I'm really driving to here, telling you about this at all, is that there was one person who took all the clues and came to the conclusion that the treasure had to be somewhere along the route of the Cumbres and Toltec Scenic Railroad. And I will put on the website a link to the whole document, or I guess would be the way to put it, this person's article that they wrote about how they interpreted all these clues that were available and why they thought they all pointed to somewhere on the Cumbres and Toltec Railroad. So there you go. There's an interesting little tidbit. So off we go. Okay, so here's Antonito, which is where the Geology Special originated in last year, in 2019. June of 2019 is when this happened. So ran from Antonito down to Chama, took all day to do it, as we were stopping at various cuts in the rock. Anytime there was interesting geology, and we would hear from, there was about 4 or 5 relatively local geology type experts along with various concentrations, and each of them would talk about the stuff that they knew about. It was kind of fun. I will show you some pictures of that here in a minute. Just another general shot of activity at Antonito. They're loading up that train for a day's departure. In fact, I think that's the train that followed us. We'll have to make sure. We'll have to check the numbers when we see it. But there was a lot of activity on the railroad this day, and this train was getting in the midst of it. It was the oddball. It's the one that only runs once a year. But the regular trains that run half day and full length trips on the railroad were running as usual too. And as you might imagine, since we were stopping and starting and stopping and starting and talking, it took us all day to get down to Chama. We were kind of in the way. Our train was, so we'll see a little bit of that later on too. There's another photo of that train departing. This was a different trip. I didn't have any of these shots from this time, just to give you an idea what the station here looked like. Now this is getting, I think our train is 460, our locomotive is 463 for this Geology Special today. As I noted, the railroad is a narrow gauge, a 3-foot narrow gauge. This Mikado 282 locomotive was, of course, an original Denver and Rio Grande Railroad built in 1903 by Baldwin. It has a kind of an interesting history in that it originally was built as a double-cylinder locomotive, but it was changed back to single-cylinder about 6 or later on in the 1907, 8, 9, somewhere in there, because it proved uneconomical, basically, to maintain the double cylinders. They weren't getting enough savings of fuel and whatnot to make it worth maintaining the double cylinder, so they switched back. This locomotive was eventually sold to Gene Autry, the famous cowboy actor, singer type, in 1955, and then he in turn donated it to Antonito, the city in Colorado, and it was eventually restored into service on the Cumbres and Toltec in about 1994, I think, is when it went back into service. Here's some activity. I think this 484 locomotive on the right is the train that's going to be chasing us, so to speak, until it gets past us at a point on the route. And 463 on the left is our train, our locomotive. So here's a shot inside one of the cars. It was a full train. We had plenty of people, but we also had plenty of seats. There were inside cars and outside open gondola type cars. And we did the talks mostly on the outside. It was a beautiful day, fortunately. So we did most of the talks out in the open car. We get pretty unobstructed view of whatever the speakers wanted to tell us about. We got a book prepared for us about the geology of what we're going to see, and here this guy's looking at on the right-hand side, right page of the book is basically a route map of where we're going to be going and what we're going to be, some mileposts sort of things for geology interest, and on the left is a geologic cross-section of that route. The cross-section on the left relates to the red line on the right. That's where the cross-section is cutting through the railroad. So we had a lot of information presented to us all day, which was really great, if you're into rocks and railroads, of course. There's another view of what one of the insides of one of the coach cars looks like. Okay, so here we're starting to build up some knowledge of the geology of the area and so on. The red is basically the railroad route, obviously greatly simplified, running across from Antonito on the right in Colorado to Chama on the left in New Mexico. And it really cuts through three main areas, a big picture geology. One is the San Luis Basin, and I always get a big kick out of the fact that there's a San Luis Valley, San Luis Basin here. And we came from San Luis Obispo and all the San Luis things in California. But anyway, so San Luis Basin is a big, relatively flat valley area where a number of cities are, and then you leave Antonito, you cross what feels like plains almost. It's pretty flat, very gradual ascent into the Tusas, I'm not sure how to pronounce this, Tusas Mountains, and you go over the mountains. The highest point being that Cumbres Pass that we talked about at just over 10,000 feet, and then you drop down into or get most of the way down into the valley on the other side of the Tusas Mountains called the San Juan Basin. And it becomes another area similar to the relatively flat area around Antonito. So that's the big picture of what we're going to be seeing here. Another very fascinating thing about, I find it interesting, is that much of the geology that we see here in Colorado along this route is not just similar to what happened in San Luis Obispo to cause what can be seen there along the Pismo Cliffs, the Seven Sisters volcanics, and all that sort of stuff. It's not just similar, it's the same thing. Both sets of geologies were caused by one of the tectonic plates known as the Farallon plate, which you can see in this diagram on the screen, went underneath, well, subducted beneath the Pacific plate, and that's not only what caused the Sierra Nevadas and a lot of the volcanics more recently, but also further inland on the Colorado Plateau created the San Juan volcanics, the Rocky Mountains in the area here. It's exactly the same activity, not just similar. It's the same one. Some of the stuff that we'll see along this trip and some of the geology along the cliffs in Pismo is the same stuff. It's basically volcanic ash turned into rock. That kind of a rock is called a tuff. There's various kinds of them. T-U-F-F, by the way, is how you spell that, not the T-O-U-G-H. This is T-U-F-F. And in our case here in Colorado, a lot of volcanic activity. Just to give you an idea, the one mountain around that kind of produced most of the ash and volcanics in this area here in Colorado produced about 1,000 cubic kilometers of this tuff. And just to give you an idea, Mount St. Helens produced, it erupted about 1 cubic kilometer of ash and ultimately, potentially, the rock type tuff. So just to give you an idea, it's a lot of activity here. We're not going to be looking at these kinds of maps too awful much. We'll generally be looking at pretty pictures. But this is the first part of the trip. You can see Antonito up here in the upper right, and we go across that relatively flat plain and kind of start winding our way uphill over here to the left. This is basically the first part of the trip. Most of what's seen here are rocks in the ages of 1 million to 25 million years old. Mostly that tan and purple stuff, not the pink or white. And those correspond in age to a lot of the rocks that you see in the San Luis Obispo area, those tuffs and whatnot, the Seven Sisters Peaks. All that activity was in the around 20 million years ago, give or take 5 million years or something. So very similar age to what you see in both locations. Mostly dark basalts. That's a magmatic or igneous rock type here, and obviously, since it's similar geology, back in San Luis Obispo too. Okay, here we're crossing, still early on in the trip, we're going across the relatively flat San Luis Basin at this point, and you can see how we often would gather outside of the gondola cars. In the lower middle, you can see a speaker. They had a sound system set up on these open cars. And I think you could hear the lectures too if you were in the coaches, but generally the people talking were out on these open gondola cars too. There's an interesting shot of some of the equipment. I think this might have been the first time we entered New Mexico. You can see we're still in the San Luis Basin. Things are still flat. And we will cross back and forth between Colorado and New Mexico, go back and forth across the state line 11 times on this trip. There's just an interesting shot of the train and some of its crew. I didn't mention, if you have questions along the way, use the chat thing. You can get my attention that way, and I'll try and answer them. Or we'll also do some question and answer time at the end too. We had a chase vehicle, this little orange speeder who was behind us the whole time, presumably just making sure we were okay, didn't start any fires with the ash or any of that kind of stuff. There's another good view of the open car that we would do most of the talks with a water tower in the background. You see we're still pretty much on this flat plain kind of area, San Luis Basin. Okay, so now we're entering. We've been kind of coming along the flat here. You can see the winding black route of the railroad, and it gets windier and windier, and we're now getting into older and older rocks too as we climb the mountain, so to speak. And by old I mean pushing 55 million years old, something like that in this area. But it's still the whole area, and almost all throughout the time this area is being built, we're talking about volcanics and plutons being pushed up, and another form of igneous rock material, or another source of igneous rock material. So we're not really changing rock types particularly, just how old they are. And there's some more recent erosional stuff too, some sedimentary rocks and conglomerates and so on. We'll see some of that as we go. Well, and here is some of it. This is very typical of where we might stop along the way, talk about these rocks, which are volcanics in origin. You see we're still out in the flats. If you look at the broad behind the scene there. Now you kind of get the feeling you're starting to climb a little bit. Get into the mountains, the Tusas Mountains, or Tusses. There's a broad shot. You can tell we've gained some altitude now over the plains, which would be back to behind us and to the right. And you can see here we've obviously gained some altitude. That's that bridge that we just crossed. You saw in a couple of previous pictures. Now we're considerably higher than it was, but we're still close enough that we can see it. And here's there was amazing the number of spots where we went through the rock type, and basically you could almost reach out and touch these outcrops, and perfect for stopping along and being told about what's going on. These are river erosion, I think, conglomerate type rocks generally. Most of these look like, in this picture, they look like they're pretty even sizes of sediment pieces. The sand grains that make up these rocks are pretty even. Here in a minute, actually the next slide, I think, there are some other areas in this rock where the grains, the individual pieces of rock vary tremendously from really large chunks, individual chunks of rock like these and this and this guy over here, all the way back down to little sand grain type sizes. A textbook example of a conglomerate rock, meaning all kinds of different sizes of sediment. In this picture, another river deposit kind of thing that you see is this cross bedding. You can kind of tell there are parallel lines here, but then over here the parallel lines cut through. This is a feature known as cross bedding, and what it tells you is basically these deposits were made in an environment where the water was moving, whether that was like a seashore coming and going with wave action or currents along a river or stream, but there was water moving. Oh, and there's, just to show you, there was some animal life. I think there's a couple other pictures of stuff we happened to see along the way. Now we're starting to get into more of the volcanics as we climb, and older too. Remember, as we go up this mountain, we get older and older rocks. There's a good close-up of these volcanics. And there's a good distance shot. You can see we're gaining altitude still, and a great view of these volcanics. Probably the tuffs. I'm not entirely sure about that, but the ash layer from some of those volcanics 20-some million years ago. You can see it cutting all the way across this picture, this one layer of it anyway. We're going through one of the areas where some of the work equipment was. There would be crew housing type buildings or facilities for keeping equipment and so on at periodic spots along the railroad for the track maintenance people mainly. There's some of the buildings. Here we are across a valley. We're winding our way hairpin style up this mountain. And here you can see the railroad track that we just left, following along here where the cursor is going. And then through this road cut and on back and out of the picture on the other side of this area of the hill. We did that a lot. We would look back and see where we had been in cuts like that. Here's more of the conglomerates from more recent deposits, and you can see again big chunks. There's one big one. There's a big one right above that guy's hat. There's one you can see for these, and then there's plenty others that are the chunks are very small to the point where you can't even make them out, sand grain type size. And there's a shot down the valley of the river, the Los Pinos River. Pretty lush, actually. You can obviously see where the river runs, where all the green is, real green. And then up on either side, it's not quite as lush. It looks like there ought to be a golf course down there. I don't think there actually is, but it kind of looks that way. There's just another nice shot of the train about to go through another canyon type cut. And now we're in that cut that we're just approaching. And once again, lots of volcanic rocks. These are the ones that are now starting to push 30+ million years old. There's some of the tuff. The volcanic tuff, it comes from the ash. They often refer to it as a welded tuff sometime if it's particularly hard, where the ash has been enough compressed and maybe another material flowed through it that gave it a kind of a binding power, or a glue, you might say. Some of it can be pretty darn hard. There's just another fun shot of the train. This is a fun formation that we found up towards the top of the grade here. These are known as spires, and they're called the Conejos spires because they're out of the Conejos rock formation. It's a geologic name they've given to this particular formation. Again, volcanic sediments interbedded with lavas and tuffs and that sort of thing, and then ultimately eroded. I mean, this material would have been solid through here way back when, but in the eons since, much of it has been eroded away, but some of it was particularly more resistant to erosional efforts, so they stayed in place. and became these spires, as they refer to them as, kind of throughout this section of the trip. We'll see a couple more probably. There's an area right in front of us. This big chunk is that same material. It didn't get eroded to such a clear tower-like rock, but it's the same stuff being eroded also. And in the background over here in the upper left, you can see another one of these spires, maybe not quite as tower-like as the others, but still. Here we're backing into a siding or a spur to get out of the way for the train that's been behind us up till now. Remember I told you that we're going slow, kind of dawdling our way, and the regular trains that take the regular half-day and full-day trips cover the ground much quicker. So we had to get out of the way a couple of times for the train to catch up and go past us. And there we are sitting in the siding with the railroad guy throwing the switch for the oncoming, well, not oncoming, the train that is about to pass us is coming up from behind us. And here he comes, 484. There's our number for which one it was. I think I have a couple of pictures. Yeah, there's the cab crew, the one that's going past us. And there's some of the passengers on the train going past us. And now it's pretty much past us, and we get a view of the tail end of that train as he disappears around the curve. Oh, there he is, disappearing. And as soon as he gets out of the way, our crew will throw that switch and we'll start out again. Okay, so now a little geologic map, just to let you know where we are, what we're doing. We're about to approach a tunnel where the oldest rocks are. We're coming in from the right over here, and here's where a tunnel is that's got the oldest rocks that we'll see on the trip. And where we get a look down into that Toltec gorge that I talked about earlier, that 800-foot gorge that we go through. And then we start working our way, the final assault, you might say, on the mountain. And at the other end here is where we hit the Cumbres Pass, where we stop going up and start coming down into the San Juan Basin, and ultimately to Chama, New Mexico, the end of the line. And now we're talking about pretty solidly older rocks, like a couple 100 million year old, up to a couple 100 million year olds. But also in the tunnel, which we'll talk about in a second, even considerably older than that. So here we go into one of the tunnels, an approach tunnel, to the main one that we're going to talk about. And here's an interesting rock face. You can see a definite boundary between two different rock types, where the cursor's kind of running, where it's white, much whiter on the bottom, and more orangey, pinky colored rocks on top. What usually creates something like that, particularly if it's a curved layer as opposed to a straight line layer, even if it's slanted, curve versus straight line. The curve usually indicates some sort of erosion happened between the deposition of the lower rock and the deposition of the upper rock. So the lower rock was put in place. It was uplifted enough to be subjected to erosional forces like rain and wind and so on, that rounded it, because it probably was flat to begin with. And then much later, the rock type on top was deposited on top of that deformed surface. It also is possible that this was magmatic or a pluton kind of emplacement, a bubble, if you will, of magma below the surface, which could easily have rounded tops. So that is another possibility. You would have to dig into it a little more to figure out which it really was. There's some more of those spires. You can see the track that we just left behind us over there on the other side of the valley, running through there. Well, now we can see that rock type, that surface that we were just looking at between the lighter color on the bottom and the darker color on the top. This is clearly sedimentary rock, not magmatic, so it would have to be what I described at first, the deposit of the white stuff. The white stuff was eroded to be curved and irregular surface instead of horizontal, which you would expect from a sedimentary rock, or a straight line anyway. It might have been tilted, and then later, after the whiter rock was eroded, the rock type on top was deposited, which is also sedimentary. You can see all kinds of different granular sizes in here. There's our engineer enjoying the ride, or I guess that's the fireman. More of those spires. We did see a few of them on this trip. You notice that the tree types, well, in fact, there are a whole lot more trees than when we were out on that plain, but the forest has taken on a kind of a new look up in the Tusas or Tussis Mountains. Some of the rocks were colored by probably by flows of liquids or steam or something like that through them that were carrying sulfur or other color-creating materials. So it got kind of pretty. There are some fun spots in the United States where there's whole areas that are kind of rainbow-colored because of this sort of thing. Typically in hot spring areas where there's either hot water, hot liquid, or hot steam carrying this stuff through the rocks. More spires, more of those volcanic rocks. And now we've made it to the main tunnel. We're about to enter a rock formation that's somewhere between 1.5 and 2 billion years old. That's billion with a B. So this is definitely the oldest rocks that we encountered, and on this entire trip. They stopped the train before entering the tunnel. Obviously, we've all gotten off. We get to walk through the tunnel. It's not that long. I will see a picture of it in a minute. And then we get to position ourselves at the other end of the tunnel for a grand re-entrance, so to speak, of the train at the other end. I must admit there were probably more people taking pictures of the train than the rocks. It kind of hurts the geologist in me, but it's okay. I took a lot of pictures of the train as well. So here we are heading through. That's my grandson. He was the one who was with me, Matteo, when we took this trip, and we're about to head into the tunnel following those folks who are already down the path a little bit. And it wasn't very far before we saw daylight at the other end. A few hundred feet maybe, I don't really know, but it was a pretty short walk. And there's a look down into the gorge that I keep talking about, the Toltec Gorge. From top to bottom at the highest spot, it's about 800 feet. That's a long way down. And that was a pretty mighty river running through there, too. You can see how turbulent and active it is. This is in June. And there's some nice pretty flowers in the rocks. There Matteo's found, he found a number of interesting rocks to look at here. Hanging on that chain of his, he's got a loop. It's called a geologist's loop. It's basically a little 10-power magnifying glass that lets you look at individual grains and mineral crystals and such in a particular rock to help identify it. There's a few more of the goodies he found at this spot. And here comes the train through the tunnel with all of us positioned to get good photos of it, basically. And it was kind of fun to see him come chugging out of there. That was cool. And here you can kind of see a picture now of where all the people were watching that train come out of there. There's some folks out on a rock overlooking the gorge. Doesn't look all that impressive there, but then look at this picture. It definitely becomes a little more impressive. I was not about to go out there where this guy is. That would not have appealed to me. But I appreciated him doing it. It gave me a good picture with something for scale, meaning his body for scale in the picture. Up there, oh, this is interesting. Up there, just outside the tunnel, there's this monument put up there. Back in 1881, the railroad workers in the area at the time, and this is when the railroad was being built, basically, did a little memorial service for James Garfield, President James Garfield. He was assassinated, as you probably recall. It was not buried here or anything. He was buried in Ohio. But they had a memorial service here for him, and they put up this monument to commemorate that event, the memorial service. So now we're somewhere between the tunnel and the Cumbres Pass, the high point of literally the high point of the trip. There's another view down into the gorge. It really was fun listening to that locomotive all day. And now you can definitely see that the topography is changing into the San Juan Basin eventually, which has a kind of a different geology. We'll talk about it when we get there. Some more volcanics on the left. Something I thought was interesting enough to get a picture, as did I. There's another view of the river from up above as we're continuing to climb. And now we're approaching the midpoint of the railroad at Alcier, I think that's how you pronounce it, where it's actually a little town, and there are people who live there. They're there now, I think, only to support the train. And you can see parked there at the station, Alcier, is the eastbound train coming from Chama going to Antonito, where we started out. So this is a passing point. If one of your options, if you only want the half-day trip, is you can take the train to this halfway point and then switch trains to the other side and go back to where you came from. Otherwise, you're going to go all the way and then get bus back to your originating point. This is also where they feed you. They have a fairly good-sized dining hall in that yellow building there, a gift shop, of course, too, as I recall. And remember that 484 that passed us? He has already been to Alcier and is now on his way continuing to Chama. So he's across the valley out ahead of us by a little bit. And now we're in the station. Basically, that's the train on our left is the train that's headed back to Antonito, which you could, at this point, under normal circumstances, you could switch trains and go back to where you came from if you wanted to. 9,637 feet elevation, 318 miles from Denver. I had a gondola car on my G-scale railroad that looked just like that. And that's our train. There's a water tower that's there, a station, various infrastructure buildings for railroad maintenance and crews and that sort of thing. They had a mock-up of what the station might have looked like, the station office, that is. And there's the water tower with a close-up of its level meter, what the water, and tell you what the water level is. And now I think we're heading out on to Chama. There's some other nice views of the river valleys that we would see coming down out of the mountains. It felt much wetter over here for some reason. And I'm not sure if that's because we were seeing the rivers as opposed to seeing tributaries and such on the other side, or maybe they didn't exist on the other side. I don't really know. But this seemed like a much lusher side in a way. And now that we're over here, we're getting into more of a topography that's caused by glaciation. Glacial moraines, erratic boulders, all that sort of thing, caused by glaciers moving through and dropping material that they've been carrying for who knows how long. There's another little town along the way with a water tower. I think there must have been at least 4 or 5 spots along this railroad where water towers were. Wildlife. That was always fun to see that. Oh, and I happened to catch that hawk. That was kind of fun. As he was buzzing by the train. There's some volcanics still in the picture. We never really leave the volcanic. We find younger sediments on top sometimes. We find glacier material on top sometimes. But there's so much volcanism in this area in that 10 to 20 million year ago period that determines a lot of the geology that you see along the way. And here we're approaching the Cumbres station, which is very close to the actual peak of the pass, Cumbres Pass. And then you can see now we're 330 miles from Denver at an elevation of 10,015 feet. 4% grade is the ruling grade, by the way, on this railroad getting up and over this pass. That's pretty steep. More spires, more volcanics, more spires. There's kind of a fun picture. I always enjoy it when they blow down a little bit or cause a lot of action with the steam. There's the track we just came past. You can see it running across here. Notice the snow too. This is in June, and we're still melting snow up there. And now here's the final section into Chama. So we're entering on the right. We're going down through this valley where we'll see all the glacial features, and then into Chama. All this dark green stuff, rock type, is old, very old, 100 to 200 million years ago. Some of it into the Jurassic period, which some of you remember Jurassic Park, right? Dinosaur time. The lighter green, this chunk here would, if we could have seen it, I don't think we really got that close to be able to see it. But that stuff was over 200 million years old from the days of the dinosaurs. So now here we are in real life. That gives you a great feel for glacial deposits in this area coming down this valley into the San Juan Basin. These mounds are probably what they refer to as moraines, glacial moraines. It's basically where the glacier stops moving so much and drops or deposits all the rocks and material that it has scraped up along the route from wherever it came from. So you see these kind of rounded features, rounded potholy features, all glacier related. Here's some more. On the right particularly, you can see more of these mounds. There's our train route on the other side of the valley. That would create deltas too. The smaller rivers coming down from the sides would deposit stuff at the bottom where it flattens out into deltas. Not as large as the big deltas like you see coming out of the Mississippi coming out into the Gulf or something like that. But on a smaller scale, it's the same idea. The river hits that larger area, spreads out, slows way down, loses lots of energy, so it drops all the rocks, or all the material that it has in it. It settles out there in the form of a delta. That was just a pretty picture, I thought, interesting forms that the snow might take in the process of melting. That's not a glacier. Remember I mentioned the word erratic? There's a geologic term that has a geologic meaning. When you refer to something as erratic, it means that it doesn't belong there. It's totally out of context for the type of rock it is. To find a hunk of granite, a boulder of granite in amongst a bunch of sedimentary rocks, that would be out of place. And that's kind of what's going on here. It's because it was brought here by the glacier. The glacier would have knocked this chunk of rock off of whatever mountain it was carving, or cliff it was carving, or valley it was carving, and eventually had carried it all this way, and then at the end of its life, or where it stopped, it ultimately melted and dropped this in a place where it has no business being under normal circumstances. It's called an erratic. There's some more of the geology along the train route. You can see down here at the bottom. There we go. You can see where the rail route went. Again, more volcanics. There's some more animals. Aspens too. We hadn't seen aspens till we got down on this side. Some new growth in June. Oh, this is an interesting little spot that we went past. Remember I told you that in some instances you can have some sort of a rock material, this lighter colored pink in this case, and kind of yellowy too, deposited, and then a period of time where it's eroded, and then something different later put on top of it. Well, that's what's happening here, and here's the boundary between the two is roughly this across here. There's a term for this called an unconformity. And it kind of gives you the idea that one rock really doesn't belong to the other. They certainly don't conform to the same time period. What it amounts to is there's a missing period of time here. The rock underneath is old, but the rock on top, which you would expect to be younger, is actually much younger. There's a period of time missing, the time when this bottom one was being eroded, all the way to when the top rock would have been deposited. There's a huge gap in time. And interestingly enough, the gap in time here is actually greater than the unconformity that you see. There's one of these features in the Grand Canyon. There's about a 200 million year gap in the unconformity at the Grand Canyon, and this is actually greater, on the order of 250 million year gap in the geologic history between the bottom and the top. So that's kind of fun. That's the sort of thing, if you didn't have some geologists with you on the trip, you could look at that and say, yeah, that's pretty, but have no idea how interesting it really is. Another water tower. Oh, I like that picture. You see the rainbow over here on the lower left being caused by the blowing down of the steam from the locomotive. That was a lucky catch. Let's see. Oh, somebody said here that the correct pronunciation of that mountain range is Toosus, I think is what he's trying to say. Too_S_U_S. Toosus. We're getting close to the end of the line here. We've pretty much come down from the pass, these pretty trees, and we'll soon be. And here's Chama. We're in the rail yard now at Chama, which is actually kind of a bigger rail yard than at the other end. You don't really get that feel here. I didn't get a grand sweeping picture, but that it is. Okay, we've made it to the end. This last slide, I always have a last slide like this to tell us, remind us that if you would like to donate to the museum, there's an address for doing that on the web up in the upper left-hand corner. For future Parlor Card chats, you can go to this page in the upper right-hand corner. It's got all the information for all the chats. If the chats have already happened, they were recorded, which means you can go watch them, listen to them anytime you want to. There's a feedback thing, survey at that location. There's also a link to it off the chat page. If you want to tell us topics you might be interested in seeing, you can react to some topics that are thrown out. And finally, in 2 weeks' time, September 26th, 10 a.m. Pacific time, our next chat's topic will be a trip that Lynn and I took with another couple up the coast from San Luis Obispo on the Starlight, visited 3 of the great lodges in the national parks in Oregon and Washington, and then took the Starlight home from Seattle. So if you're interested in seeing some of those train pics and a couple of shots of the lodges, just to give you an idea of what you can do using the train as your basic mode of transportation, but you know, getting off and doing some other things as well. So let me see if I can get everybody turned back. See if there are any questions anybody wants to ask. Oh goodness, you're not coming across very well. Okay, well, there's something. All right, well, I think we'll call it quits. Thank you all for joining in today, and we'll see you again on the 26th.